The story of Syngman Rhee, the first president of South Korea, is one of profound paradox. Born into a world of tradition and fading imperial power, he would become a figurehead of modern, Western-style democracy, only to rule with the authoritarian hand of a pre-modern monarch. His life, marked by decades of exile, relentless political struggle, and a ruthless pursuit of power, serves as a compelling narrative of a patriot whose ultimate undoing was his inability to separate the cause of his nation from his own unyielding ambition. Syngman Rhee was born on March 26, 1875 in Hwanggi Province, a time of significant change for the once independent Kingdom of Korea. His family boasted a proud lineage with ties to the Korean royal dynasty, tracing their ancestry to King Taejong of Joseon as 16th-generation descendants of Grand Prince Yongyong. This connection to the old aristocracy gave Rhee a sense of destiny and a firm belief in his own right to lead his people. He received a traditional Confucian education, a path that prepared him for the notoriously difficult civil service examination, the Gwaegyo. Yet his journey took an abrupt turn when he enrolled in the Pai Chai Academy, an American Methodist missionary school, where he received a Western education and converted to Christianity. This dual background, simultaneously rooted in Korea's ancient past and exposed to the radical ideals of the West, would prove to be a defining feature of his character, shaping a leader who would champion democracy while embodying autocracy. In his early 20s, Rhee's traditional and Western education coalesced into a zealous nationalism. As Korea fell under the influence of Japan and Russia, he became politically active, joining the Independence Club in 1896. This group of young men organized protests against foreign empires, driven by a fierce desire to assert Korea's sovereignty. This period of activism, however, was short-lived. In 1897, Rhee was arrested and imprisoned on charges of conspiring to overthrow King Taejong. His 6 years of imprisonment until his release in 1904 at the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War were a brutal but formative period. He was tortured, yet during this time he transformed from a political activist into a martyr for the independence cause. It was within the confines of his cell that he wrote his seminal work, The Spirit of Independence, and compiled a dictionary, activities that solidified his intellectual and moral authority among his peers. This crucible of pain and intellectual work reinforced his uncompromising resolve and set a precedent for his unshakable conviction in his own righteousness. Upon his release from prison, Rhee fled to the United States, a move described by some as an exile. His time in America was dedicated to a single, consuming purpose: the cause of Korean independence. He immersed himself in academia, earning a bachelor's degree from George Washington University, taking graduate courses at Harvard, and ultimately becoming the first Korean to receive a doctorate from an American university after completing his PhD at Princeton in 1910. During this time, he was profoundly influenced by Princeton's president, Woodrow Wilson, whose principles of self-determination Rhee would later use to advocate for Korea's plight. The next 3 decades of Rhee's life were a tireless global campaign of political lobbying, with his base of operations primarily in Hawaii. He became a ceaseless spokesperson for Korean independence, working to cultivate international support for his cause. His efforts were not passive. He actively built a coalition of American supporters, often framing Korea's plight as a test case of American exceptionalism and a moral failure of U.S. foreign policy. His decades of persistence paid off. When World War II ended and Korea was liberated from Japanese rule, Rhee was the only Korean leader well known and trusted by the Americans. This decades-long campaign was not just a side note in his life. It was the primary function that made him indispensable to the United States, an act of political self-creation that directly led to his anointment as a key leader in the new political order. This period also reveals a pragmatic side to Rhee's ideology. While he would later become known for his militant anti-communism, his views were, for much of his life, more anti-Soviet than they were anti-communist. He was willing to acknowledge what he saw as positive aspects of communism, such as its focus on the equal value of human beings, a concept he contrasted with Korea's traditional caste system. Rhee's own words illustrate his belief that ideology was a secondary consideration to the cause of independence, stating that, If communism will help this work, we should all become communist without delay, but if this work seems to be damaged by communism, we can never agree to it. This was not the position of a rigid ideologue but of a calculating nationalist. He only fully embraced an uncompromising anti-communism when it became the most effective means to secure American patronage and prevent the Soviet-backed North from dominating the peninsula. This political opportunism demonstrates a chillingly calculating aspect of his patriotism, as he was willing to use any ideological tool to achieve his ultimate goal of a unified, independent Korea under his rule. After World War II, the geopolitical stage was set for Rhee's return to power. Korea, a nation that had been liberated from Japanese rule, was immediately and against its will divided into two military occupation zones along the 38th parallel. This arbitrary line, drawn on a National Geographic map by U.S. military officers with no Korean input, was intended to be a temporary measure. However, the onset of the Cold War and the failure of negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union made this temporary split permanent, leading to the establishment of a communist regime in the north and a U.S.-backed government in the south. Initially, the U.S. State Department had concerns about Rhee's intense hostility toward communism, fearing it would hinder cooperation with the Soviets. His return to Korea was consequently delayed until October 1945. Upon his arrival, Rhee immediately began a campaign for immediate independence and unification. His rise was not a matter of political luck but a carefully orchestrated and at times brutal process. Supported by Lieutenant General John R. Hodge, the U.S. occupation commander, Rhee built a mass political organization that was backed by strong-armed squads and the loyalty of the Korean police force, many of whom had collaborated with the Japanese and sought protection from a right-wing government. Rhee's political dominance was secured through a violent campaign against moderate and leftist politicians, which included the assassination of major rivals, leaving him as the most influential figure in the South. This strategic consolidation of power set the stage for the UN-supervised elections in 1948. These elections were boycotted by the North and many leftist factions in the South. Despite the turmoil, Rhee's newly formed party won the election, and he was elected as the first president of the Republic of Korea by the National Assembly on July 20, 1948. His rise to power was a testament to his decades of tireless lobbying in exile and his ruthless maneuvering upon his return, demonstrating that his presidency was not a democratic mandate as much as it was the carefully planned culmination of a lifelong struggle for control. Once in power, Rhee's government quickly devolved into an authoritarian regime, tolerating little to no domestic opposition. He assumed dictatorial powers, using a variety of measures to cement his control. His rule was characterized by the suppression of dissent, which included purging the National Assembly of members who opposed him and outlawing the opposition Progressive Party. In a particularly brutal act of repression, Rhee had the leader of the Progressive Party, Cho Bong-am, executed for treason. He also maintained a tight grip on local and regional governance by controlling the appointment of mayors, village headmen, and police chiefs, while his security forces detained and tortured suspected communists. The government, nominally democratic with opposition parties and elections, was in practice an autocracy that relied on electoral manipulation, bribery, and strong-arm tactics to maintain Rhee's personal rule. The economic record of Rhee's First Republic was as bleak as its political one. The regime was unable to provide the effective leadership needed for sustained economic development. The economy grew at a painfully slow rate, averaging around 4% annually, which amounted to less than 2% per capita when factoring in the high birth rate. The government's economic policy of import substitution industrialization, which aimed to protect domestic industries by blocking imports, was a failure. South Korea lacked the natural resources and large internal market necessary for such a policy to succeed, resulting in little industrial development. The economy was thus heavily reliant on American aid, which financed much of the country's operating budget and military costs. American officials often complained that these aid funds were misallocated for political purposes, noting that South Korea seemed to be a rat hole that swallowed up assistance without producing tangible progress. Rhee's regime, with no ideology beyond the perpetuation of his own power and the personal enrichment of his supporters, ensured that political and economic failures were not an aberration of his rule but the very mechanisms of it. Rhee's single-minded pursuit of power and his staunch anti-communism reached their apex during the Korean War, which erupted on June 25, 1950, when North Korea invaded the South. The subsequent intervention of the United Nations, led by the United States, saved Rhee's government from an imminent collapse, pushing back North Korean forces and restoring the pre-war status quo. Rhee, however, viewed the conflict not as a war of containment but as a final opportunity for national unification. He consistently pushed for UN forces to continue the fight and unify the peninsula under his rule, refusing to sign the armistice agreement that ended the fighting in 1953. To him, a divided Korea was an unacceptable, alien concept that had been forced upon his people by foreign powers. This uncompromising stance brought Rhee into direct conflict with his American allies, whose primary goal was the containment of communism, not the unification of the Korean peninsula. Rhee's defiance was at its most profound in June 1953, when he unilaterally ordered the release of some 25,000 anti-communist North Korean prisoners. This bold move was a calculated attempt to undermine the ongoing truce talks and force the United States to resume hostilities. The United States, having been defied by its own ally, was forced to resume negotiations with the Communists and ultimately abandoned Rhee's vision of a unified Korea by force. Rhee's relationship with his foreign patron grew increasingly strained. He repeatedly expressed frustration with what he perceived as American weakness against communism, and he lamented the lack of a clear U.S. commitment to the unification of Korea. The American government, in turn, grew weary of Rhee's intransigence and made it clear that it would not be dragged into another war on the Asian mainland for the sake of unification. The fundamental disconnect in their objectives created an irreparable rift, and the U.S. would not be there to defend him when his regime faced a final, fatal domestic crisis. The end of Rhee's rule was not a sudden collapse but the culmination of years of deep-seated public discontent. A rapidly growing urban population, frustrated by the regime's corruption and the slow pace of economic recovery, was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The final catalyst came in the form of the blatantly fraudulent March 1960 election. With his main opponent having conveniently died before the election, Rhee's party resorted to extreme measures to secure victory for his running mate, Lee Kai-pung, using police interference and vote rigging to ensure the desired outcome. The public, already furious with the regime's despotism and corruption, was pushed to its breaking point. Protests erupted in Masan on election day and the police responded with brutal force. The situation ignited into a national movement when the body of a high school student, Kim Ju-yeol, who had disappeared during the riots, was found weeks later in Masan Harbor with tear gas pellets lodged in his eyes. A photograph of his body, widely published in the press, served as a rallying cry, setting off a massive student-led demonstration in Seoul on April 19, 1960. Police fired on the crowd, killing an estimated 100 to 200 students, and Rhee declared martial law in a desperate attempt to regain control. The turning point of the April Revolution came when the army, seeing the immense scale of the protests and sensing the public's boiling rage, refused to fire on the protesters as Rhee had commanded. This single act of defiance from the military, the very force that had been his ultimate guarantor of power, signaled the end of his regime. The United States, which had grown weary of his corruption and unyielding defiance, also withdrew its support, with the U.S. ambassador publicly siding with the protesters and their justifiable grievances. Isolated and with his two pillars of power, the army and his foreign patron, gone, Rhee had no choice but to concede. He officially resigned on April 26, 1960, and was flown out of the country on a CIA plane to a final exile in Hawaii. The life of the scholar patriot, who had fought so fiercely for his country's independence, ended quietly in exile in 1965, a man whose ambition had finally consumed the very power he had fought so hard to build.